Hello, I'm Lelda Smits for the Finance News Network, and joining me to discuss the Australian Government's highly anticipated float of Medibank Private from AMP Capital Investors is its Head of Investment Strategy and Chief Economist, Dr. Shane Oliver, and from Shaw Stockbroking, its Senior Investment Advisor, James Garish. Shane, James, welcome.
Pleasure, thank you.
Float fever is rising around the upcoming privatisation of Medibank Private. Who stands to benefit the most here?
I think there's two groups who will benefit, but obviously the biggest one is probably the Australian taxpayer, who will see the level of government debt in Australia go down to the tune of the amount of money that's raised by the float. The other beneficiary, of course, is just ordinary investors getting a greater exposure to a chunk of the Australian economy.
Okay, and James, where are you anticipating that we'll see the greatest interest and biggest take-up?
I think retail investors will love this float. We've seen a lot of strong demand through the retail or through the broker book build process that's been happening at the moment. Of course, it's going to be a large cap Australian company listed on the ASX in a growth sector, so I think institutions will also want to participate. So there'll be strong demand throughout the market for this one.
Okay, and what's your 12-month price forecast for the stock, and what kind of PE ratio does that represent?
Yeah, we've got a 197 12-month price target. We've used some fairly conservative assessments or assumptions to get that price target. That'll put it on a 2016 PE of 18 times. If you're looking at a PE from 2015 numbers, it puts it on 21.3 times earnings.
Okay, if we can look closer at the health insurance market, what kind of growth projections do you have for this sector?
This sector is going to have strong growth. The bottom line is that Australians are ageing, we're living longer, and more importantly, as years go by, there's more and more spending on health-related things that obviously help keep people live longer. The technology is getting more sophisticated, and that all requires money to pay for. If you typically look at the Australian Consumer Price Index, the components of that, it's the health index, the health component, the cost of health, which is rising most rapidly each year, typically by around 5 or 6%. And when you allow for volume growth there as well, you're looking at growth in the area of around 8 to 10% per annum. So it's a strongly growing part of the Australian economy, and obviously Medibank Private will get access to that.
Now, no matter how good a company does look on paper, the Minister for Finance, Matthias Cormann, has said that, or reminded us, that shares also go down as well as up. Shane, what do you believe are the biggest risks that we should be aware of in the healthcare sector?
The healthcare sector is quite a stable part of the market overall. It's often seen as a staple or defensive part because it's exposed to longer term growth. But I guess the bigger risk might be that at some point interest rates start to rise, and that could put some of the defensive parts of the market under pressure, particularly the high yielding parts. So that's probably the biggest risk. At this stage though, that looks to be a fair way off.
Okay, and looking closer at Medibank Private, what sorts of risks have you identified for the company specifically?
Yeah, I think in relation to Medibank specifically, the competition in the sector is intensified over the last few years. We've had the invent of a lot more online distribution of health insurance. You've got the rise of comparative websites, so that, I guess, arms the consumer with a lot more information. We see a flow on impact there, that we get a lot more churning of policies, so individuals going out there looking for better deals. I think you look at Medibank, it is an insurance company, so it does invest people's premiums, so there is the risk around the potential investment outcomes that may have. And I think lastly, the Medibank is undergoing a large IT infrastructure upgrade, so I think we all know how complex it is putting an IT system through a very complicated organisation. That does have its own risks, so I think that's probably the top 3 risks from a company-specific point of view that I'd see.
Certainly. So again, with the company, what kind of earnings profile are you looking at here, and what short-term key performance indicators will you be keeping an eye out on? Yeah,
from an earnings point of view, Lelda, I think 2015 earnings are going to be fairly flat. Unfortunately, they've just lost a large government contract with the Department of Immigration, fairly ironically. In relation to 2016 and going forward, we're expecting earnings per share growth of 13% per annum. So that's a fairly strong earnings outlook for Medibank. I think in the very short term, it'll be management's ability to strip out some of the costs involved in the business, increase the margins that they're achieving. They're well below the other industry players in the sector, so I think there's a lot of room there to strip out some of the costs and get it to be operating in a more efficient way.
Certainly. So finally, Shane, what do you believe will be the most important factors in terms of Medibank's profitability going forward?
Well, I think as James said, it's really about containing costs. So you've got a strong growth environment, so the industry that Medibank Private will be operating in will be doing very well. The key, I think, is for them to control their costs, and then following on from that, I'd be focused on how competitive the sector becomes. There are a few strong competitors in there, and obviously it's how well Medibank Private competes with the industry. Obviously the rest of the industry will be trying to take share off Medibank Private as time goes by, and Medibank Private will have to respond to that.
Okay, and finally, James, you are an investment advisor. Will you be getting involved in the float?
Yeah, I think it's a good one. We've been suggesting that clients take a good hard look at Medibank Private. I think you've got to understand that it is in the context of a diversified portfolio, but no, it does look good from my point of view.
Fantastic. Well, James and Shane, thank you so much for your insights today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lotta.